my most favorite people in the whole world alive today. He stayed at our house a couple times, and whenever we can, we hang out together. We've hung out together at conferences. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about his official bio before I pull him on the air. Andrew D. Basiago is the team leader of Project Pegasus and the founder and president of MARS, M-A-R-S. He is an American lawyer, writer, chrononaut, and 21st century visionary. Andy served in Project Pegasus at the dawn of the time-space age and was one of humanity's early Mars explorers. He is a prominent figure in the truth movement, leading a campaign to lobby the U.S. government to disclose such truths as the fact that the U.S. has achieved quantum access to past and future events and has used time travel to place a secret U.S. presence on Mars. Andy has been identified as the first of 2 planetary-level whistleblowers predicted by the Webbot, which analyzes the content of the World Wide Web to discern global trends. His truth campaign about time travel and life on Mars is based on direct personal experience serving on 2 U.S. defense projects. Excuse me. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Andy was a child participant in Project Pegasus, which was the U.S. time-space exploration program at the time of the emergence of time travel in the U.S. defense technical community. He was called back into government service in the early 1980s when he made numerous visits to Mars after being tapped to join the CIA Mars Jump Room program. For over a decade, Andy has investigated his secret project experiences on a quest to prove them and communicate them to others. He was identified in his early childhood as an indigo child with special abilities, including the ability to use his mind to levitate small objects and to perform telepathy by reading the minds of others. He's a past member of Mensa, the High IQ Society. He holds 5 degrees, including a BA in history from the University of California at Los Angeles, UCLA, which is also Dr. Lesson's alumni, and a Master of Philosophy from the University of Cambridge. Sasha, would you like to add something before I ask the first question and bring Andy on?
Okay, yeah, I'd be happy to. I really have immersed myself in the data and tested the null hypotheses, what it would take to prove Andy incorrect, and I'm absolutely convinced of the veracity of Andy's accounts. I'm convinced by the internal evidence, how consistent it is, the collaboration of actual living witnesses, the comprehensiveness of the data. It's at a level which would stand up in a court of law, but what really gets to me, since I'm a cultural anthropologist, is that my data from ancient Sumer has numerous references to all kinds of facilities that the people who settled Earth from the planet Nibiru set up on the planet, and
on Mars.
On Mars, this was in direct shuttle experience that they had, and I'm sure they left stuff, including statues. And what I'm going to ask Andy is, was there anything with square corners, stuff that looked like ruins, that man-made either from ancient times or more modern times when it gets to the question time?
Well, why don't we start with that question, Andy, and then when you're done answering that one, let me know, and I have a different question.
And how you got to observe Mars. That's, we got to get that first.
Right. Well, it's great to be with you again, Janet and Sasha. I'm in Sun Valley, Idaho, kind of taking a rest after my recent speaking tour. And it's just, I almost feel like I'm back with you in your recording studio down on the island of Maui. That was only a couple of months ago when we had the phenomenal interview with Michael Tellinger. Yeah, I think that what I can add to Sasha's brilliant work in the sort of Sitchian literature, the notion that life was seeded here by the Anunnaki and there was an important interaction in ancient Sumer, is that when I was a child in Project Pegasus, we were literally told that it wasn't a matter of the origination of life on Earth, but that after the solar system catastrophe of 9500 BC, humanity was kind of going sideways, where our ancestors were very advanced and intelligent as we are. They were basically the same creatures that we are in terms of their physiology and their intelligence and so forth. But they were living in a primitive state of existence because that that catastrophe around 11,500 years ago, which utterly devastated Mars and Earth, created a situation where our ancestors were, advanced tool-bearing modern human beings, but living at a primitive level. So, for example, Otzi, the Italian Iceman, had over 40 tools on his person when his body was discovered with the melting of the Italian Alps. And his body has been dated to 5,500 BC. So that's a modern reference I'm making to corroborate the fact that back in the early 70s, when we had our Yellow Book lessons under the tutelage of the U.S. Department of Defense, they told us that civilization was kick-started again. It was reinitiated, and that we were living in a second civilization that followed the flourishing of civilization, or I should say the re-flourishing of civilization with extraterrestrial assistance in ancient Sumer about 5,000 years ago. And that would explain why, for example, both the Masonic and the Hebrew calendars date the history of the world to about 5,000, somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago. Well, those aren't references to the founding of the world, the establishment of planet Earth. They're references to the time period in which we've been living in the current civilization. The world as a human construct was reinitiated in ancient Sumer. Now, what I can say from our Mars data is my organization has already proved the fingerprint of the high Egyptian civilization on Mars. Now, we don't know precisely when that civilization began, that reached essentially what was the zenith of the first civilization on Earth. What we know is it was devastated around 11,500 years ago, as, for example, verified by the flood markings on the Sphinx. So that great maritime civilization that built the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx was on Mars. And I can't emphasize enough, this has not really gone widely reported, and it's kind of being shoved over to the side of the discussion. But the really brilliant team of Mars anomalists, all of us essentially amateurs, that now number over 5,000 members of the Mars Anomaly Research Society on Facebook, several of our members have found exceptionally important data on Mars showing that that first civilization on Earth that we speak of as the High Egyptian went to Mars, was going there, as Dr. Lesson just stated, in terms of having craft to reach Mars, and left their fingerprint there. So, for example, one artifact that was discovered by Ross Curley of Mars, the Mars Anomaly Research Society, which coincidentally or curiously was photographed by the rover Spirit on Sol. The Martian days are called sols. They're a little bit longer than Earth days. On Sol 2012, the rover Spirit, imagine the coincidence there, found it's an intaglio in either a piece of metal or a piece of rock. We really can't tell. It's either stamped or carved into a flat surface up in the corner of this slab over on the right side of the rover that clearly shows an Egyptian pharaoh. It's actually somebody who possesses both European and African features. And as Dr. Lesson surely knows from his work in anthropology, the High Egyptian civilization was so advanced that to make peace with their Ethiopian adversaries, at one point during the reign of the pharaohs, they adopted some of the brightest children from the Ethiopians into their leadership class and actually essentially groomed them to become pharaohs. That was the famous reign of the black pharaohs. So this individual, who actually bears a striking resemblance to President Obama, as somebody of a mixed racial heritage himself, is not arguable. It's clearly evident in the image, and so we're referring to this as the Rosetta Stone, proving that the High Egyptian civilization before the catastrophe was on the surface of Mars.
Oh, Andy, if I can just cut in for a minute, Phil Coppens, the late Phil Coppens, had said that he and others had thought that perhaps there was some kind of a transportation chamber or device, either not dissimilar perhaps to those that you experienced, that was able to actually transport between Nibiru perhaps, but somewhere out there from the pyramids themselves. And the idea is, was it a system of pyramids sending energy or doing whatever it is to transform, to move people through space as far as Mars from those days when they're before the Great Flood.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. It may have even been a teleporter, because we find in some of the Egyptian hieroglyphs essentially something like the Tesla teleporters that I confronted in Project Pegasus, which would basically be two straight or elliptical-shaped armatures between which radiant energy was propagated, and then they were leaping through and literally tunneling to Mars. And it's
So
not
that's the
just the
exact.
Egyptian.
I know that in Angkor Wat, the king in the Khmer High period would go into this place where a serpent, which usually means some kind of a machine or device, actually made love with him in the form of a female and transported him. So all over the world, I know it's very exciting, Andy.
Yeah, and there's even, the way, I don't think that the data can be, ultimately I think the data is going to be viewed how I first encountered it when I studied just Tsiolkovsky Ridge in NASA image PIA 10214 as I analyzed it in my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars. It's almost as if Tsiolkovsky Ridge is a heritage sculpture garden in which they left little memorials to the groups in antiquity that were reaching Mars. For example, up on the far left corner, which would be the southern corner of Tsiolkovsky Ridge, as you scan from left to right in NASA image PIA 10214, we find an Asiatic head in the nature of the Buddha figures that we find in China and in Southeast Asia. Basically a very rotund face with eyes with an epicanthic eye fold, which we know emerged among Asiatic people at the end of the last ice age about 20,000 years ago. So the ruins can't be any more ancient than that, this particular object, which clearly shows that they were, I think, that they were trying to leave evidence of each particular group on Earth that had reached Mars. And so I think the statuary shows that they were creating memorials. So my view of it is that the Earth cultures before the catastrophe in 11,500 BC, or BCE, before Common Era, were commonly reaching Mars and leaving, I'm not sure they were colonizing it, but they were leaving evidence of their presence there. So for example, in the Discovery of Life on Mars, I show the presence of an Egyptian sarcophagus on the escarpment of the far western edge of the home plate plateau. As you look across, as you look across the West Valley of the Columbia Basin of the Goosehead crater of Mars. So there's just two objects.
This is so parallel to the kind of signs that were left on the Nazca Plains, and also at Tiwanaku, where they had have a walled memorial on the way to Tiambo, there's showing all the different races, including the extraterrestrials, the Greys, the Coneheads, who had visited Earth. And this is the equivalent that you pointed out that can be verified right there on Mars. And I guess, are people using something like a Google Mars to really focus deeper and deeper and deeper? How do they come up with this kind of advanced imaging, Andy?
Well, what we're doing is we're taking NASA's own images that are released, and then we're recognizing that they encompass a very large land area. I mean, the example I've been using is, imagine you place a still camera in Mulholland Drive above the San Fernando Valley and take a photograph of Van Nuys, California. And they're usually not that much space, but they're very large framed photographs, so that what you have to do is you have to go down to a very small level organization and extract the details. When I did that to Tsiolkovsky Ridge, I not only found the Buddha-like Asiatic head indicating a Chinese or other Asian presence on Mars during the last, which is to say the first civilization on Earth, which was regularly going there, but I also found several heads in the nature of statues with the distinctive conical headdress of the High Egyptian civilization, some of them with the distinctive icon at the middle center near the brow line of the icon that was known as a Wadjet, which you may recall was the symbol of Lower Egypt that became the cobra ready to strike motif that was the national symbol of all of Egypt during the reign of the pharaohs. So we pretty much closed up the evidence now to establish that during the reign of the pharaohs, when that international, multiracial, maritime-based civilization emerged that built pyramids in Egypt and in Mesoamerica and in Southeast Asia, and now we're finding maybe even in Antarctica and other places like, for example, Bosnia. They were regularly going to Mars, and they were purposefully leaving evidence of their presence there. So I think that pretty much defeats the idea that Earthlings came from Mars and essentially used our planet to escape to, before, during, or after that great catastrophe. What happened was that we had gone to Mars. We were regularly going there. We're a larger planet. Even then, we clearly had a more biodiverse and lush environment, much greater vegetation, much larger supplies of water. So we reached Mars, but we were cut off from Mars by the catastrophe. So we're really living in an incredible period of human history now during this epoch of civilization, which we can directly experience because it makes up the time of our lives, which is we're reconnecting to Mars and we're reestablishing our presence there after a very long hiatus.
What buildings did you see? Were there any ancient ruins, and what were the modern buildings like on Mars that you saw?
When I was going up between July of 1981 and May of 1984 for the CIA's Mars Jump Room program via an advanced transport device called a jump room that was actually a dual use of the elevator in a huge aircraft building, the elevator in the center of the building at 999 North Sepulveda Boulevard in El Segundo, California. I made about 40 jumps during those 3 years when I was an undergraduate at UCLA. And by my reckoning, I certainly encountered 5 or 6 jump room facilities that were basically maybe about the size of a small insurance company, just some strip mall kind of building.
One story kind of thing.
One story, they basically, well, 2 stories, because it was usually, the jump room was invariably underground, sort of elevator landing, and then we would walk up into 1 story above ground, and then when we were in that structure, we would then walk out onto the surface. So that's what the U.S. presence consisted of then at that time. Now, what did the
building look like when you were outside of it and you looked back at it? Did it just look like a ranch-style 1-story house showing from above the ground?
Well, they were sort of adobe-like, and yet the structures. The Ralph M. Parsons Company, which was my father's employer, and some other major defense contractors had done some of the buildings. So they were sort of utilitarian rural buildings like you might find at a mining site.
Well, thank you. So this is so useful because this is what we can, the more of these things that we know what we're looking for, that we can show, then more and more the lies that have been put upon us about what's there, it gets shattered. So this detail is really useful. Thank you. What else did you find as far as buildings that you could see?
Well, there were pyramidal structures. Most of them were highly eroded. We didn't have a sort of aha moment where we walked around a mountain and found a huge, pyramid the size of the Great Pyramid. They were more eroded than that. So I believe that Egyptian presence was on Mars early in the life of the civilization. It was the first civilization on Earth that got destroyed, and with it the damage to the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx and so forth around 9500 BC. One of the things that I can add to the investigation of the statuary on the surface of Mars that has really not permeated the Mars anomaly research community to any great depth at this point is that Mars has areas where predators reign and areas that are relatively safe from predators because in the history of the Martian civilization, predators have just not favored certain areas of the terrain. What the statues often are signage, which is to say that if you're in an area where, let's say, there have been many predator attacks of humanoids on Mars, both the indigenous Martians and others, the Martians will often construct a statue that, let's say, shows a reptoid creature chasing or devouring a humanoid. In an area where that's not the case, they'll build almost cartoonish, sort of happy-faced statues that, for example, Louis Michael Reinhardt of Mars has indicated to me he's found a great number of. Okay, so what we have to do is do more significance thinking about what we're looking at. In the case of the statues on Mars, we're not necessarily looking at a tradition where they simply let either their artists or their juvenile human beings go out to the surface and do everything from very, very amateurish, cartoonish, simple designs worthy of a junior high school student to works of art that are utterly, astonishingly exquisite in their execution. What we see actually is a long-standing tradition of using statuary as a form of non-verbal, non-textual signage to indicate to others that the area is either safe or unsafe to stay around in for very long at sufferance of being basically devoured by a predator on the surface. And then the other thing I can add to what we're finding so much of, we're finding a proliferation of human and other simian skulls, heads, faces, profiles, and masks. And I think this is a profound anthropological significance. And what they indicate are access points on the surface to the primarily underground Martian civilization, where we, for example, would have an exit in a building. They'll put a skull, and I don't mean a fossil skull. They'll actually construct very large skulls, artistically speaking. They'll sculpture them so that Martians and other humanoids on the surface know where to run if, for example, they're being chased by a predator. They'll know they can scamper through the eye sockets or some opening near where that representation of a human head is and seek refuge underground.
Is the cranium of the skull Homo sapien?
Well, sometimes the skulls represent our skulls perfectly because there has been an earthling presence on Mars. Essentially, the first type of Martian, the Homo martis terras species, are our long-lost relatives that descend from the Earthlings who went to Mars before the catastrophe. The second group, Homo martis martis, are the indigenous Martians who are smaller than modern humans. They have longer heads. They sometimes have horns on the left and right side of their heads above the ears. They have pointier chins than us, longer fingers, a spindlier body, and they have a characteristic sort of recondite or fearful persona, which I don't think necessarily indicates or results from the fact that they're afraid of us, although they are, because we are of the species of hominid that basically colonized their planet in antiquity, and while we're not persona non grata with them, they're certainly wary around us.
Do any of these?
Type of Martians,
yes, go ahead.
Well, the third type, Homo martis extraterrestrialis, look very much like the gray extraterrestrials, but they're clearly adapted for terrestrial living because they're just more sort of tenacious in the way that they hold things and hold to the ground. And I remember seeing one of them on top of one of the jump room facilities. And so I think they're probably a branch of the Greys. When the Greys and the Anunnakis intervened in ancient Sumer to bring forth civilization again on Earth, I think they left a contingent or they created a genetic hybrid so that species falls somewhere between, let's say, the small Greys and a lemur, if you will, basically a tenacious arboreal primate from Earth. And
Andy, I wanted to ask you, if anything had 6 fingers or toes, because of the earlier Homo sapien type, because Sitchin hints but doesn't really come out and say it, that at least among the royalty there was often a 6th finger and a 6th toe, which may or may not have been removed early on. And I just wonder if any of these creatures that you've seen or others have rapped to you about that they saw there had 6.
No, but this is a cosmic coincidence because I was just discussing this afternoon at my guest house here in Ketchum, Idaho, that I dated them all back in the 90s who had 6 toes but 5 fingers. So that genetic anomaly is still present, I think, in the human genome. So she was of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, so maybe that would be from the Mediterranean part of the human genome would come through from the Anunnaki, as Sitchin has described. No, I can't identify that in the Martian data, but I can say that I think that the indigenous Martian phenotype sometimes present on Earth, because how else would we explain that we have an innate fearfulness of the Homo martis physiology. We're fearful. I mean, we've used the kind of frightened, horned creature, human alternate, as the embodiment of what a demon is.
Right.
We've demonized the indigenous Martian, and I think that's because they were coming here during the previous epoch in human civilization, and that explains that explains the the catastrophobia that Barbara Hand Clow, the Mayan elder, has articulated, the notion that we are fearful of Martians, that we attributed war to the planet Mars itself, even though it doesn't seem to have done us any harm. And in fact, when we were going there regularly in the 70s and 80s, it's not as if we were being attacked by the three predominant Martian humanoid species. So I think that that's a legacy of the fact that after that phenotype started appearing on Earth as a result of cultural diffusion from Mars, that is to say the indigenous type of Martian that sometimes has horns, that we attributed something fearsome or something that we should be afraid of to that typology, because after they arrived, both Earth and Mars, and presumably possibly a third planet called Malduk or Marduk, was destroyed by some kind of incoming projectiles from space, and a lot of damage was caused to all three of those planets.
You know, Lord Byron, the guy from Gallipoli, supposedly had those horns and kept them hidden. Did you ever hear that story?
No.
He was one of them.
I haven't. But I mean,
Wow.
you know, we're finding these precursors. But we
knew someone who actually lived in our community for a while, and it looked like under his skull he would have had horns. It was like it was not coming out all the way. Remember that one guy from Seattle? I wanted to interject something. First of all, Nimma has in the Lost Book of Enki, Sitchin describes how Nimma went by Mars around 450,000 years ago and erected the first monument, which we think might be the Mars base that Hogan talked about in Cydonia. But there were pyramids. So you were commenting earlier about how run down the ancient pyramids. They might be hundreds of thousands of years old, and that's why they're so eroded. So that's one thing. And then the second thing I wanted to talk about was there's a story of the rape of the Sabine women and the Mars. Remember this story? You tell the story.
No, these were the astronauts. They weren't. They were part of the shuttle service when they were still taking the gold to Mars back and forth. And they came down in great numbers for Marduk's wedding. Marduk had declared his alliance with the humans by wanted a public wedding with Sarpanit, who was a half-breed. And so they came down, and after the wedding, they grabbed the 200 of the prettiest girls and said, "We are in rebellion, and we're taking over, and unless you recognize our marriages." And these became the giants, the Goliaths of the world, and they had the area of Jericho as reserved for them. But we digress.
Well, I'm talking about the Mars invasion type thing. So there was a miniature Mars invasion that's been depicted in famous historical
these
drawings.
were by these great big guys.
Right, and so perhaps also we see in ancient renditions that there were grays. You know, they have. The Anunnaki were hanging out with the grays. So maybe the Martians brought down. The Anunnaki Martians brought with them the indigenous Martians with the horns, and then that got anchored with the fear-based. We're being attacked by the Martians, and this is what they look like.
Everywhere the Nibiruans went, they took slaves, and if they could catch indigenous people or whatever, that was their habit, and they enslaved people. So that would certainly be consistent, Janet.
Thank you. I have a question. I'll take this in a little direction. And so there are many forms of teleportation and time travel and variations on those themes. These include spiritual, shamanic, psychological, and technological methods. They also include astral projection, near-death experiences, shamanism, meditation, dreams, remote viewing, hypnosis, hypnotherapy, and theogens. Some of the teleportation and time travel technologies are of human origin. Others are of extraterrestrial or ancient aliens origin. So, Andy, could you please tell our listeners about the methods and systems of out-of-body, which may be physical or through the mind, and teleportation and time travel systems that you were exposed to and are involved with, and how they may relate to one another or are different.
Certainly. I was exposed. I was exposed to 8 different modalities of time travel between 1968, when I first Tesla teleported to New Mexico with my late father from New Jersey, and when I left the program at the end of the summer of 1972, and then I was exposed, of course, to the 8th technology in the jump room as a college student. So I plot them on a spectrum that goes from the purely psychical to the purely physical, with a kind of an area in the middle that we might describe as sort of physio-virtual. So there, in my opinion, there isn't bodily spiritual teleportation, except in moments of where you have an avatar doing that, or sometimes when people are in a life-threatening crisis, they will spiritually teleport. So let me try to parse the different types of time travel. The first kind of time travel that I think we can identify is remote viewing. In remote viewing, we use the human mind to identify what's going on at a spatial remove, at a spatial distance. And then that spatial distance can either be in real time or it can be in the past or future at that location. But it's purely psychical. The time traveler is aware of what he or she is doing and is using the mind to go there non-physically and see what's present. In Pegasus, we were doing that for the Office of Naval Research. I'd like to say that the children who ended up actually time traveling, or physically time traveling for Project Pegasus, were small mediums at large. We were remote viewers for the Navy, and that's how we got inducted initially into the program. The second thing they were doing was, and I wouldn't necessarily urge people to try this at home, but it works for both adults and children, which is if you lay somebody on a table with a spiral image above their head, and you place their head at the middle of the table, not like Vitruvius Man, but essentially on a table large enough where their body is in the orientation of Da Vinci's Vitruvius Man, but their head is in the middle of the circle, the table, the midpoint of the center point of a circular platform, and you spin them at 33 rotations per minute clockwise, you can train them to relax their gaze and then their mind and go out of body. And we were regularly doing that when I was a child in Project Pegasus without nausea. And in fact, one time when I was journeying through the astral dimension after leaving my body, and then I was debriefed upon coming back, I told the nurse from DARPA who was debriefing me that what I had seen is a physical barrier that I couldn't move past. And this is a direct quote. She said, "Yes, others are reporting that or have reported that. We think it's the infrastructure of the device propagating the hologram in which we find ourselves. We're calling it the Matrix." And this was in 1970, 1970, 29 years before the Wachowski brothers made the first of the Matrix trilogy in film. So that's of limited value, obviously, because that was sort of an exploration of the astral. It was neither sort of time traveling to a concrete location nor visualizing a concrete location. It was more or less an experiment in what astral consciousness is. Something similar was the Montauk chair, which almost certainly was reverse engineered from the pilot's seat aboard a downed extraterrestrial craft, because to travel interdimensionally or even at a great rate of speed, simply dimensionally, simply in the time-space continuum, the cosmos, whatever you want to call it, the extraterrestrial craft, to get here from distant star systems, would have to be able to know where they were going before they got there. And so the ET pilot is essentially a psychic who's piloting the craft with his or her mind, enhanced by the chair that the pilot is sitting in, which we reverse engineered into a human consciousness enhancer that during Project Pegasus in the late 60s and early 70s was simply called the chair. But then when Project Montauk was spun off from Pegasus, became known as the Montauk chair. And what the Montauk chair was in Pegasus, although it may have been put to greater purposes in Project Montauk, was simply a magnetic transducer that allowed the person sitting in the chair to pre-experience a subjective episode, a moment in their own future, not to see themselves doing it, and not a hypothetical future, but to literally go forward in consciousness and pre-experience a moment that they would then experience much later in life. So I, for example,
would having that moment and knowing of it and then coming back to the present give them the option of changing that occurrence?
Actually, what I saw, this is a very complicated question because both the act of going there and where I was on timelines kind of are intermeshed, so it's hard to really interpret because I was moved accidentally and then intentionally through at least 3 timelines. I had basically 3 timeline segments in my life because of a glitch that occurred teleporting home from the Sandia National Labs in 1971, and then an attempt to put me back on that alpha timeline that was done at the beginning of the summer of 80. So when I talk about whether or not my probes to my own subjective future have been fulfilled since I was in the Montauk chair, some have and some haven't been, but I don't think that's because of the vagaries of the chair. I think it's because of the vagaries that I literally was slipped to other timelines so that they could not have been accurate, but that some have been true. So, for example, one time I saw myself practicing law in Seattle. Well, today I am a lawyer who is admitted to the bar in Washington State and practices throughout the state of Washington, but I ended up not moving up to Seattle because of the traffic. I don't like sitting on the freeway for 2 hours doing nothing. And so I ended up purposefully choosing against Seattle, and I chose Southwest Washington across the Columbia from Portland, Oregon, because it's simply, for me, a much more enjoyable place to live without being stuck on the freeway for many hours a day. So so I ended up fulfilling that episode that I saw in the Montauk chair in terms of its major premises of practicing law and in the state of Washington, but I've yet to live in Seattle, and I don't think I ever will. So, but I don't think that's because of the inability of the Montauk chair to send me to a particular location in my future. It's that I've moved to another timeline where I have a different future.
Right.
There was also the question of error in the Montauk chair. I mean, for example, one time when Ed Dames was working with me in New Mexico in the Montauk chair, I told him that what I had just seen was being at a public rally where President John F. Kerry was speaking. Well, when I ended up living the moment, it wasn't a Kerry presidency. It was the Kerry campaign for president in 2004 when I was standing to the left side of the stage and looking over at Howard Dean, the governor of Vermont, who was then the chair of the Democratic National
Connecticut,
Committee.
I think.
Oh, yeah.
I wonder if there's a picture of that.
Well,
Anyway.
what I was looking at was Kerry and Dean standing in Pioneer Square in Portland, Oregon, and what I saw over my left field of vision is Kerry for president. So when Ed asked me, what did you see this time, Andy? I said, President John F. Kerry.
Oh.
And it wasn't. It was actually from his candidacy as president, not his presidency. But at least that gave the U.S. government, for example, the intelligence value of being able to identify particular persons of interest. Because, I mean, if you reach the stage where you've garnered a major party endorsement or nomination for president, you're definitely on the scene, right? So I gave the knowledge of.
Can I just say that, you know, Dean is still head of the Democratic Party, and hard as it may sound to some, Kerry might still be a candidate for president again.
That's true. It's not over until the votes are counted in 2020. You know, John Kerry indeed could be a future president of the United States.
What I wondered was, I wonder if anybody could sort through the pictures of that episode, and you may be there somewhere in photograph today.
Oh, I was there. I was there with my friend, the writer Evangeline Thompson, who worked on the Fatima trilogy with me. And in fact, she invited me to go down to downtown Portland and attend Kerry's appearance. Now, sometimes, especially later, I did one. I mean, I was. So
you went
in
there
the
in this time to that episode that you.
Oh yeah, that was one of. Yeah, that was one of the.
You were remote viewing, so you weren't physically sent there. You were remote viewing.
Well, that's the paradox of the Montauk chair. The Montauk chair is a little bit more complex than remote viewing in the sense that when you go there, you're in your embodiment. You're in your shoes, so to speak, not just seeing yourself at a distance or an event at a distance. But I was just making the point that in the case of the Kerry presidency, I tried to interpret what I saw when I went to that moment in my life in 2004. So some of the data that was being reported back to DARPA and the CIA was not accurate, but it contained enough of a semblance of a future event where they could say, well, okay, this young man who spoke before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in late April of 1971 about the atrocities in Vietnam and so forth, was a person of interest relative not just to being elected to high office, but to possibly becoming president. Okay, so but then when they modeled the Montauk chair by attaching leads to our brain and externalizing the output from our brain, which I experienced when I was a freshman at UC San Diego, 2 mornings a week. I was walking from my dorm room at Muir College at dawn over to a psych lab at Warren College, at what we used to call Fourth College at UC San Diego. And I was sitting in a Montauk chair where by 1979-80, which was my first year there, actually my freshman year that I spent at UCSD before transferring to UCLA, I gave them dispositive information about the Clinton-Gore presidency that was literally visualized on the screen. And I know from the accounts of some of my fellow Montauk experiences, that is to say experiences of the Montauk chair, like my friend Hesper Natali, who has just come forward about her experiences in the Montauk chair at an elementary school in Santa Clara, California in the mid-'80s, around 1983-84. By 79-80, then into the 80s, one thing that has not really been widely reported about the Montauk chair as a time travel device is they were actually visually rendering our internal pictures of our future life experience on a screen. So I was sitting in front of a screen where they're externalizing my thought processes, and I could literally focus in, and doing that, I identified Bill Clinton and Al Gore as president and vice president. And the person working with me said, when? And I said, the 2 terms before the turn of the century. So that was 79-80. So I gave the U.S. government dispositive, sensate data about the Clinton-Gore presidency 12 years before they were elected. And we don't even know what the later Montauk experiencers like Hesper were generating, but we do know that often their image was being externalized, but the docent or team leader who was working with them was looking at the external images and then guiding them through their thought processes. So at some point they decided to choose the middle ground between letting the person in the Montauk chair see what their brain was imaging or then just guiding them through it. So there were really sort of 3 different modalities that emerged in the 70s and 80s. So
you had leads attached to your brain because there was, I think it was called Fast Forward. They were showing how they had tables of people, and they were doing the same thing, remote viewing, but they were cataloging what they were seeing, and then they were graphing it to get the most accurate future, and then kind of correlating it with where we were going, So
yeah,
they had dozens of them.
Yeah.
Did you ever get to see one of the screens? Did you ever see the screen that Ames and those guys looked at?
Yeah, that's the point I'm making. Between the early days when we were just sitting in a chair, we would have this subjective experience of visiting a moment in our own future. That was in the period in the early 70s, let's say 69 to 72. We were just sort of like astral voyagers visiting our own future. And then we would come back and we would be questioned about what we saw sort of in real time when we were in our future. Okay. Then in 79-80, when they brought me back into the Montauk chair, they had found a way to attach leads to our brain just on the surface of the skull, actually through the hair. I mean, my hair wasn't even shaved. It was just putting these little wires onto the head with a little bit of adhesive. And I was sitting there early in the morning, just after having finished my own sort of lucid dreaming in the early morning, and I was externalizing my thought processes, my output, so that, for example, when I saw Bill Clinton and Al Gore, what I was seeing was the input that I would get when they announced their candidacy in the future, and I was modeling it on the screen. The point I'm making of Hesper's experience 3 or 4 years later as an elementary school student, somewhat younger than I, is that by then they had decided not to let the Montauk subject look at the screen, but actually mask the visual screen so that it was kind of a hybrid of what we were doing in the early 70s and then what I was doing in 79-80, which was essentially it was the facilitator who's looking at the screen, and they were saying something like, Well, I'm seeing that there's, you're in your apartment in 2005, in Seattle. There's a television screen on. Can you go over and see what's on television and tell us what you see?
So they went from they went from you're passive, but you're explaining what you saw, then cutting out your explanation and just getting pictures, and then taking the step further, actually intruding in your mind and telling you what to look at.
Essentially, yeah. I know that with. By the way, there weren't just Montauk boys; there were Montauk girls. I've spoken with several of them. Right. And in the case of Hesper Natali, who's one of the ones who's come forward recently, she described how she knows that the facilitator was watching a screen and had actually explained that this will externalize your images, but will have you do the imagining. We'll have you go forward to your own, as a psychic child, as an intuitive, and you'll go forward and try to see what you're experiencing, but I'll be able to see the externalized video output from your internal thought processes. So there was really a growth in what they were doing with the Montauk chair, so that by the time Project Montauk came along, let's say in 1983, which was over 10 years before I first was placed in the Montauk chair around 1969, 14 years earlier, I believe they were doing everything to the children sitting in the chair. And in fact, that may explain why Project Montauk veterans speak of the Montauk boys, because they may be selected the male gender and not involve girls, so they could get a baseline on what the kids were seeing when they did certain things to the chair, the child, or the room, for example. Mm-hmm. They could administer narcotics to affect the thought processes of the child. They could irradiate the chair to see if it changed the field of magnetic transduction that was being propagated to boost the mind forward in time and so forth. So I don't easily discount or readily discount the claims made within the Montauk subculture itself that the Montauk chair was being used to go to Mars, because they certainly were evolving the technology through the 70s and 80s.
What do you think they were doing with that information there? What was the purpose of gathering this information? What are they going to do with it?
I know what they were doing because I was exposed to that process in Pegasus. What the decision they had made back in the early days of time travel, which would be essentially the late 60s, early 70s, was they were collecting information about past and future events and collecting them in intelligence reports that were then being internally administered in the intelligence community, and some information was being shared with participants. For example, the identity of future presidents was being shared with the individual future presidents. They made a decision, however, not to quantum engineer, because one of the problems with quantum engineering is if you take data from the past or future and try to change past or future events based on it, you diminish the value of that intelligence database. In the case of time travel to the past, you can't change the past because intervention via time travel occurs in the past's present. And what you then end up returning to is a future that already was changed by the past intervention before you took your trip. In the case of the future...
One to wrap your head around.
The future you could sell short if you knew what was going to happen in the market.
Right. Well, if you decide also to start actively quantum engineering the future, the problem with that is what you are seeing, for example, in your future chronovision or Montauk chair images is the net result of your interventions. Oh. So you keep on hiding the actual effect on the future from your interventions, because all you can see of a future event is the event that eventuates, not what would have happened had you not done the change. Wow. So in order to have a handle on what was going to happen, they decided to find out things that were going to happen in the future, like who would be president, but not try to, let's say, invalidate a certain candidate in light of that quantum access to that future event of a particular person being elected, but rather go to them and apprise them of their presidency. And in the case of some individuals, including President Obama, then providing them information to groom them for the presidency.
Wow.
So we know that was done with quantum access to future events in the case of the presidency, because when I was serving on both Project Pegasus in the early 70s and then Mars Project in the early 80s, I became personally aware of the personal knowledge of both Presidents Bush, President Clinton, and President Obama, knowing in advance that they were destined to be president, and myself, by the way, although I always put an asterisk on that I'm not going to assert that I have to become president simply because it was a data point that the U.S. government derived, when I was a child.
Well, I certainly hope so, and you've got my support.
Well, I think I've got a shot at it, Sasha, at least over the next several elections. I'm really going to make a hard run for the office.
Truth.
But I don't have the full information.
I love your platform, truth. The truth will really set us free.
Right. So that really, explains sort of the psychic forms of time travel. And then in the middle, between the psychic forms and the physical ones, I would put the chronovisor. The chronovisor went also through several generations of development when I was on Project Pegasus. At first, we were just shown a two-dimensional chronovisor. And that's an electrical optical device that generates an image of a past or future event, not unlike a television screen image. But when I was on Project Pegasus in the early 70s, working with Bell Labs, when the Vatican provided the chronovisor technology that the Vatican musicologists Father Pellegrino Ernetti and Father Agostino Gemelli discovered in the 1940s and then perfected with Dr. Enrico Fermi, the great Italian physicist, by 1952, they had that two-dimensional chronovisor. The Vatican lent it the technology to the U.S. government, and working with Bell Labs, the Ralph M. Parsons Company and Bell Labs modeled it into a third and then a fourth dimensional chronovisor, basically something in the nature of a virtual reality of a past or future event via holography, and then an actual time travel device physically to that time and place, where we, for example, could have died inside the hologram by being injured.
Wow.
So the reason I say physio-virtual is that when we were first doing three-dimensional visits, for example, my first visit was to a Civil War battle, and the Confederate forces were advancing, and I hid beneath or behind essentially a berm as Confederate soldiers were running up the berm and leaping over me. My father had explained if any of those Confederate soldiers had turned and tried to bayonet me as I was cowering beneath the berm to protect myself, I would not have been injured because we were only there as a superluminal superimposition over that time and place. As Jack Pruitt had explained during our training, as a ghost is present in our location in the time-space continuum, as a kind of an invisible yet completely solid-looking entity. But then when we were in for more than 15 minutes, they had perfected the chronovisor so that we were really there physically, and we could eat and feel pain and hot and cold and so forth. And we could have been injured or died during those probes.
Were you ever injured on a trip, or did you notice any wounds on you or your colleagues?
Well, I wasn't injured, but I certainly had a couple 3-day stays in certain places via fourth-dimensional chronovision where I had to endure hunger or thirst or cold. For example, I was in the High Points neighborhood of New York City around 1900. When they believed I was only in for 15 minutes, I was actually there for 3 days and 2 nights, and I was starving. I was ravenously hungry, but I could hardly even eat when I got home from the project, from school, quote unquote, at the end of that 3-day stay, essentially on the Lower East Side of New York City, because I was being fed onion soup for 3 days, and I was famished. Wow. I was hungry to the point of illness, of being initially unable to eat when I went home that night.
What was the purpose of
My
that
mother
trip?
asked, I beg your pardon?
What was the purpose of that trip going to 1900?
They were just acclimating us to the process of accessing primarily past events via chronovision. So they sent me to the time to a Civil War battle, in the U.S., to the time of the dinosaurs in 100 million B.C. in Arizona, to New York City around 1900, and then to the Dutch countryside in around 1800. And during some of those probes, those are some of those that I'm writing about in my book, and that are the ones I can remember, because there were many more probes than that. They're the ones that I can just summon up from conscious memory. But we were there for longer than the technicians understood.
Right.
So in some cases, we were going without food, or at least sufficient food, or the amount of food that we were used to as lucky kids.
We're going to be on a break for about 5-6 minutes. We'll see you soon. We'll be back after this commercial break. Thank you for listening. Aloha, and welcome back to the Sacred Matrix on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. I am your host, Anna Kira Lesson, with co-host Dr. Sasha Lesson. Revolution Radio is listener supported, so please do take a few minutes and go over to that donate button. Donate $1, $5, $10, whatever you can. Every dollar, every penny helps us bring you these programs. So thank you for your donation. I have a pretty interesting question here, but first, Andy, I want you to finish about the technology, and then maybe you can take a question or two from our listeners who have been. Thank you very much for putting your questions in the chat, listeners, and we will get to you as we can.
Right, Janet. Yeah, I just reached the point in sort of that spectrum of time travel technologies where everything right of that would be physical time travel. That would include Tesla teleportation. Advanced Tesla teleporters were called Stargates when I was on the project. That's the device we were using at Cerrillos, New Mexico to get to the year 2045, where we were retrieving microfilm summaries of important events occurring between the 1970s and the 2040s. Then, because of the vagaries of time traveling to the past, where if you teleported before the advent of teleporters, you would be stranded in the past. You'd be lost in time. Well, you might not be lost in time. We might know where you were, but you wouldn't have a device to get back to the present. So in addition to the chronovision, sort of on the margin of psychic and physical, or physio-virtual as it were, they developed several devices that, or methodologies that didn't require a return device. So in addition to the holograms or the chronovisors, they developed a methodology called plasma confinement, where you essentially time slip to the past momentarily or temporarily, utilizing a field of radioactive plasma. And it was after I had lectured extensively and discussed plasma confinement as a methodology that was used to get me to Gettysburg on the day that Abraham Lincoln gave his famous address there, that I then investigated the Montelimar time slip case that Jenny Randles has written about, and discovered that in the week before the famous Montelimar time slip involving the British couples, the Gibneys and the Simpsons, where they went about 100 years into the past in Montelimar, taking their car with them.
Wow.
That the entire town of Montelimar was blanketed by the largest release of radioactive plasma in the history of the French civilian nuclear power program, which literally connected an anomalous event in the time travel literature, the Montelimar time slip, to the very modality that I had previously lectured about and described on radio broadcasts that Dr. Sterling Colgate and my father used to slip me from spring of 1972 in a lab in East Hanover, New Jersey, in a chamber, a lucite chamber in which radioactive plasma was placed under confinement, to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on November 19th of 1863, where I ended up being photographed in the photograph that shows Lincoln at Gettysburg. And then finally, the jump rooms would be another form of physical, if not time travel, at least displacement in the fabric of time-space.
Wow. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened? What did you see when you went to 2045? So, yay, we make it, huh? We're still here.
Well, at least on that timeline, there was a 2045.
On that timeline.
I saw very little of what was going on because I would simply pop in a view on this grassy lawn in front of this immaculate set of buildings. They were emerald and sort of tungsten steel. I can say that the current sustainable planning initiative involving utilizing the surface of buildings as a field for vegetation was certainly in place, in the sense that the buildings were sort of synthesized with the natural environment. There were no automobiles present. The air was fresh. I could hear birds chirping. People were either walking, taking bicycles, or riding those segways that Dean Kamen has invented, where you kind of lean forward on this moving wheel, holding a handle in your hands. I could see people moving around the complex utilizing those methodologies. But the reason there were no internal combustion-driven transports of any kind present is by 2045, at least on that timeline that I visited, teleportation is so commonplace that it's recessed invisibly into the walls of office buildings. And there are as many teleport access points as there are elevator landings in our present civilization.
Wow, that's wonderful. Well, what about your trip back to, Sasha has a question. Then I have a Gettysburg question.
Well, you stay with Gettysburg first, honey.
Okay. So, first of all, you finished with the future. So the teleportation's in the wall.
We were looking at all the different devices, and we've gone through at the very end, the most physical bodily movement of persons.
Great. So I'm going back to 2045. So that was wonderful. And then you went back to Gettysburg at Lincoln's time. And then recently you went and in this body, in this lifetime, you went to Gettysburg to kind of correlate and validate some of the things you saw as a child when you went back in time. Can you tell us about that?
Did that evoke more memories?
Right. I was able, back in October, I had a TV shoot in Gettysburg, and I stayed several days later, and I reality tested my memories that I've been narrating at length publicly about going to Gettysburg via plasma confinement under the direction of Stir, as we used to call him, Sterling Colgate, and my dad. And what I found is that I know to a personal certainty that, in fact, I was sent to Gettysburg because I was able to retrace my steps and actually identify precisely where I walked. And not only that, and I'll describe where I did walk, but not only that, but of greater significance is that I was able to contact authorities on the physical infrastructure, the physical cityscape of Gettysburg the day Lincoln was there, and I beat the experts. In other words, the experts were denying there were structures on what was then the northern part of Emmitsburg Road, where you may recall from my narrative, I had walked up that street and I had been taken into a men's clothing shop and shoe store by a Gettysburg cobbler by the name of John Lawrence Burns, who in fact also was one of the heroes of Gettysburg. And I learned during this trip he was a constable of the town, so it made sense that he was helping me. But let me just go back to the physical retracing, and then I'll describe what I proved during this October 2013 trip to Gettysburg. And I was saying to people, you know, they're celebrating the sesquicentennial of Gettysburg. That is to say, the Battle of Gettysburg 150 years ago in July of 1863. And then now on November 19th, the sesquicentennial or 150th anniversary of Lincoln's famous address there. And I was telling people I was meeting, this is my sesquicentennial too, because I have not been physically back in this town since I came here 150 years ago from East Hanover, New Jersey in 1972. But what I was able to reconstruct, I was even able to go back and prompt more memories about what my father had told during my briefing at that plasma confinement chamber location in East Hanover, New Jersey in 1972. What he did is he said, we know there's a street here that goes to the northwest because it's still there. And so that you won't be seen suddenly popping into view by anybody at Gettysburg at that time. We're going to put you up there and we want you to walk south into town. Now, that was the beginning of Mumminsburg Road, where it branches off to the northwest from Washington Street. Today, it's broken up by the grounds of Gettysburg College, which expanded from one building to multiple buildings since 1863, when I was there the first time. Then my dad said, sorry.
Go ahead. I just can't wait to see what put him there means.
So then I recalled that my dad, during walking the street, literally finding, I found the map of Gettysburg as it would have essentially existed in 1863, because the map is in the 1872 Adams County Atlas. Gettysburg, PA is in Adams County, PA, and there's a map of what it was supposed to look like in the 1860s. Wow. So it had Mumminsburg Road, and I remember my dad gave me the mnemonic device of Mama. You know, somebody might call their mother Mama.
Right.
Remember, this is Mumminsburg. And then just start walking, and the first person you encounter, yell, "Hey, friend, which way Gettysburg?" Which I did to a young soldier. You may recall that through the fog in the early morning, 8:30, 8:45, I'm barefoot because my shoes have been, and one of my socks has been knocked off on the way there via plasma confinement. I yelled to a young teenage Union soldier who was walking along the road with, you know, this morose persona as if he was shell-shocked from the battle. as he may well have been, because it was the largest land battle in the history of the Western Hemisphere. There were 50,000 casualties during those 3 days of July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863, just 4 months previously. And I yelled, hey, friend, which way Gettysburg? And he stopped. He pointed his right shoulder in the direction we were walking, and then indicated with his right arm and index finger that I was walking in the right direction, pointed in the direction I'd been walking. I then let him walk ahead, and I kind of slowed down a little bit. I made, as my father had instructed me, make the first sloping right, the only right you can make from Mumminsburg Road. That'll be Washington Street. How are you going to remember if you have to ask somebody, am I walking on Washington Street? Who was the first president of the United States? That was the easy one. Right. Gettysburg, I learned, is a crossroads town, so all of the roads ultimately are named for the city that you will reach if you keep on walking in that direction. So it has Baltimore Street, Washington, D.C. Street, right? Carlisle, Pennsylvania Street, Emmitsburg, Pennsylvania Street, and so forth. Okay. So I walked down, and this is in real time now, right? I walked down Washington Street, and I realized right there in the area around Gettysburg College, where there was a soccer field that had broken up, or lacrosse or rugby field that had broken up the road, that this is where, as my father had explained, you'll encounter about 3 blocks of urban buildings, very much like historical Morristown, New Jersey is, because, of course, I was born in Morristown, and I was familiar with it, having grown up in Morris Plains, adjacent to it. And so just as I had encountered in 1863, I walked through those 3 major blocks of settled urban housing that was there in 1863, and I made a sharp left on what is now Steinway Avenue, which goes on a northeastern direction between the southern reaches of Washington Street before you get into the open area south of town where the cemeteries are, to Baltimore Street. And I walked through the shops that are there now, and I asked 3 of the current proprietors, was your shop here the day that Abraham Lincoln was here on November 19th of 1863? And all of them insisted that they were there. Then I went into the very shop where Mr. Burns had taken me into the shop in 1863 to get me the shoes and the hat and the jacket. And the proprietor said, not only was this here, but this was a clothing store. And then she pointed to the adjacent store, which was open on that wall to her store, but it was 6 inches below her floor level. And she said, this was a men's clothing shop, and that was a men's shoe shop. And the men used to step down and then get their shoes in the adjacent area. So I literally realized, I said to her, I confessed to her, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I was here the day that Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. I was in your shop. And the Gettysburg cobbler and town constable, John Lawrence Burns, gave me access to the shop and equipped me with a warm jacket and large men's shoes because I had been time traveled here by the U.S. government, and I lost some of my clothing and my shoes on the way here. And I was shivering when I walked into town, and she was astonished. And she said, well, I know the government's been up to stuff like that. And I said, yes, you've probably heard many a Civil War reenactor coming in insisting that they're the reincarnation of a Union or Confederate soldier or cavalry officer or general or what have you. But my story is somewhat different. I was sent here, and I was actually here in 1863. So I'm in the shop. I then went to the...
If the dude that helped you might not have been a time traveler that was sent there to help you. Have you ever thought that?
Well, actually, I found a lot out about John Lawrence Burns. I first found out that he was the cobbler to David Kendallhart, who was the town shoemaker. David Kendallhart, I found in the archives up at the Adams County Historical Society as David Kendallhart, lawyer, shoemaker, and town council president. His assistant was the more elderly John Lawrence Burns, who was the cobbler. Oh. So that's consistent with my original account, that he went to the back of the men's millinery shop, not the new shoe store immediately adjacent to it, literally within the environs of the same building, but on a lower level, because he wasn't going to outfit me with a new pair of David Kendallhart manufactured shoes. He outfitted me with the worst, the oldest, the most decrepit pair of shoes that he had been working on as a cobbler. He was the fix-it guy in the shop. Wow. I found out that the Kendallharts were active in the Underground Railroad. So when I described previously how Mrs. Kendallhart, she actually kept her maiden name, she was known as Aletha Ann Bowen. Mm-hmm. Because they were active in the Underground Railroad, well, she must have been confronting John Lawrence Burns about when I was in the shops and time was speeding up and slowing down, so I couldn't really discern what she had taken him to task about. But I could tell she was upbraiding him. She must have been saying something like, John, what are you doing giving our old clothes away? We need those for the men that are coming north.
Oh,
right? Because they're not going to be giving their livelihood away to the escaped slaves that they were assisting reach freedom in the north through the Underground Railroad. They would have equipped them with secondhand jackets that they had retrieved from the battlefield, et cetera, et cetera. Old shoes.
Andy, I got to tell you that that doesn't sound just like a speculation. That sounds like something you heard, and you're just now remembering what you heard. That's what it sounds like to me.
Well, actually, what I'm describing is that I had described how the proprietress of the store came in, and I could clearly tell that she was upbraiding him about giving away free clothing to me, like the shoes. And what I'm saying is that I discovered during this recent trip that the Kendall Harts had a reason to be covetous about the worst merchandise in their shops, the merchandise, let's say, like secondhand shoes that they would have John Lawrence Burns repair, because they were equipping men who were, and women, presumably, who were coming north to freedom, because they were the couple that was active in the Underground Railroad in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, at the time of the battle. In fact, when the Confederate forces came into Gettysburg, the Confederate General Jubal Early confronted David Kendall Hart, John Lawrence Burns' employer, as the town council president, and said, you either give me every bullet and every piece of food in this town or $50,000, or I'm going to kill you and your town council. And David Kendall Hart fled town and was out of town when the battle occurred. So here was John Lawrence Burns' employer. Regarding Burns, I found that I described how he so readily helped me and how he kind of just wandered into view like he was touring the old downtown of Gettysburg and decided to help this poor wayfaring stranger from 1972, namely yours truly. I found that he was not only town constable, but that in Emmitsburg, where he had previously lived, he was known for taking these sweeping early morning walks, even when he wasn't constable, offering to help people, giving people directions, talking to people who were up early in the morning, top of the day kind of thing to you. And also that during his lifetime, he and his wife, who was an invalid, she was paralyzed, she was a paraplegic, adopted the most controversial orphan in town, Marcia Gibbons, who was the daughter of a woman who never worked in the very industrial town of Gettysburg, but survived her entire adult life on donations in the almshouse. So John Lawrence Burns was such a humanitarian, especially vis-a-vis children, that he adopted the most controversial orphan in that generation of Gettysburg inhabitants. So I correlated a lot. I also found that Lincoln didn't walk to the Gettysburg Address. When he left the Will's Hotel, which was more like a bed and breakfast at that time, he actually rode a horse in a parade down Baltimore Street and then made that right at Emmitsburg and then made a sweeping turn around the right side of the dais. So when I was describing how my dad said, Lincoln will be arriving here on the right side of the dais from the Will's Hotel, I had never been informed of exactly what Lincoln's passage through Gettysburg was. And in my radio interviews, I've been stating that the Will's Hotel was right or west of the dais, as Lincoln was standing on the center of the dais, giving the Gettysburg Address to the north, from the north side of the Evergreen Cemetery, which was a civilian cemetery. What I realized my dad was talking about is that's where Lincoln arrived on his horse, dismounted, and stepped upon the dais. And at 6:04, that's when the cheer went up that I heard as I was standing about 100 paces north of the dais with my back to where Lincoln was sitting down to give the Gettysburg Address three hours later, after Edward Everett gave his long, lengthy, famous pre-Gettysburg Address to Lincoln's address. So I had some of my locational descriptions off. In fact, the Will's Hotel is north of the speech site, and what my father was describing back then is this is where he'll be arriving. So just go in front of the dais and stand there, because Lincoln will ultimately show up and walk onto the stage and sit towards the center of the dais. So, but the way I proved that my account was truthful and accurate in a way that even defied the historians of Gettysburg is I not only identified those three shops through the testimony, the oral history of their current proprietors, but I did some archival research, and I found that the stone house that you encounter on your left when you're walking south on Washington Street and you make that left on what is now Steinway Avenue to go up to the shop where John Lawrence Burns helped me, that stone cottage on your immediate left, called Dobbin House, there was a study I found when that property was for sale, and that stone cottage was built sometime between 1776 and 1849, and then O'Rourke Tavern across the street from the shop where Burns helped me identifies itself as having been established there in 1829. I then consult with several historians and archivists up at the Adams County Historical Society, and because they were in possession of the 1872 Adams County Atlas, which doesn't show any commercial establishments on that small piece of Emmitsburg Road between Baltimore Street on the west and, Washington Street on the west and Baltimore Street on the east, they are going based on archival information, and they're not aware of the fact that there were multiple shops on what we now call Steinway Avenue, which is where Burns helped me. I also recovered the data. I said he just drifted over and the dais was on the right. What I had omitted, and which walking the site allowed me to now remember, is I followed him to the right over some muddy street. We then made a left and went along the cemetery, and then made a diagonal left and then went down quite a distance to where the arches are on the eastern side of the Evergreen Cemetery. And from there we walked in and stood in the front of the dais. So I was able to basically complete that segment that takes you from what Emmitsburg Road down to the civilian cemetery where Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. And that was contrary. The presence of those shops was contrary to what the Gettysburg experts say, because they don't have the advantage of having gone there the day that Lincoln was there. They're just relying on maps from the 1870s that omit those structures. So I actually caught I basically proved my account against the established opinion of some of the historical experts of Gettysburg at the time Lincoln spoke there.
Wow, fascinating. Josh, you want to say something?
Well, it's another subject.
Okay.
Unless you, I do want to. So my listeners are really interested about comments you made on an earlier show that Obama, when he finishes his term, has said that he was going to come clean, and it would be so consistent with Basiago presidency that. But one question I have, also because you're a constitutional lawyer to some degree, I wanted to, is could Obama pardon himself for his crimes?
Against humanity. Yeah,
well, that's untested water. I mean, it would be subject probably to judicial review. I don't think a president can pardon himself, because when he's serving, a president is still subject to the criminal law, and he's subject constitutionally to the impeachment clause, which cites high crimes or misdemeanors, and hence he would have to be held perpetually liable for potential criminal offense as president for the impeachment clause to be invoked. So my opinion, as somewhat of a constitutional lawyer, certainly as a practicing trial lawyer, would be no. He could not pardon himself, at least for crimes committed while president. Perhaps for crimes he committed before the presidency. But the problem there would also be the same. We can theoretically, because it's not iterated in the Constitution, we could theoretically impeach a president for a past high crime or misdemeanor. For example, President Obama's commission of federal loan fraud by applying for undergraduate Fulbright funding, claiming at the time that he was a foreign-born individual and applied to Occidental College, not as a Hawaiian, but as an Indonesian.
So I would just wonder then, as a president, if you would consider pushing through or advocating telling the truth and reconcile. Anyone that comes clean can start with a clean slate. All you ask for is the truth, like they did in South Africa, and that way it would make it safe for people who have been complicit in mass murders like Obama to come forth and give us a whole new start under a truth administration under you.
Well, certainly as somebody running for the presidency under the banner of truth, I'm going to be calling for a truth and reconciliation process modeled on the South African experiment. Because in many cases, it's not important to hold somebody personally liable. It's more important just to know from somebody who has served in the executive branch, the intelligence community, or the military what happened. And I think that's the paramount truth with a lot of these controversies. In the case of Obama, let me go back and and sort of go through what has occurred here regarding our belief that he has stated that he might come forward or will come forward regarding his involvement in the CIA's Mars jumping program of the early 1980s. What happened is our fellow trainee jumper and whistleblower, the great Bernard Mendez of Staten Island, New York, who is literally a legendary figure in the U.S. intelligence community because he personally rescued hundreds of individuals, not just on Mars or primarily off-planet, but primarily on this planet, from foreign captivity, lost in jungles, lost in deserts and so forth, lost in foreign capitals. Okay, what happened is Bernard Mendez still has cachet to consult with the president because of his status in the U.S. intelligence community as a retiree, but somebody who's done a whole heck of a lot for the country. So what Bernie described is he went to the Obama White House and dealing with the president at 1 degree of separation, basically through a reporting aide, basically through an intermediary to the president. Obama stated the following. He stated that he remembered the jump room program, that he remembered being in it, that his memories were very vague, almost dreamlike, indicating possibly that he, like William Stillings and I, had had some attempt to suppress our memories of what had happened to us, that he remembered me vividly. And, of course, that's a very real or honest statement because we were trained together, we roomed together, we were partying together with the other trainees in summer of 80, and I went on several exploratory missions with Barry, as we then knew him, with Bernard Mendez, but that he was not going to reveal his involvement in the program until after he leaves the presidency, and that would make sense. If he revealed his involvement now, he might potentially be impeachable for revealing a sensitive military secret as chief executive. So an argument might be made of some kind of malfeasance of office. The other fact that's undeniable is that if I reach the presidency, or even if I'm on the scene, as Courtney Hunt predicted regarding one of the presidential election cycles, or several of them, I'm going to be able to hold Barack Obama's feet to the fire, as they say in politics, and stick by the truth, which is he was a participant in that program, and his presidencies, his two periods in office, have essentially been an example of the breakaway civilization that Richard Dolan, the brilliant UFO historian, has articulated, in the sense that Barack Obama has twice been elected president with no public awareness or discussion of the fact that he was a participant in the secret space program. I think that's lamentable, and I don't think that Barack Obama would want to continue to lie when somebody seeking the presidency or holding it, namely myself, would be bringing and would clearly have brought other whistleblowers forward and be adhering to the truth of what happened, which is that he was in the program. So for your listeners' benefit, I would say that what I know is what Bernie has told me, and Bernie has consistently been a truth teller with Brett and I and with the public. And I don't think he would say that if it wasn't true, that was the response from the Obama administration, namely, not now. It's too sensitive for the president to address. He's got his own destiny to fulfill as president, his own projects to work on, to utilize the presidency to achieve some semblance of a greater public good, but that because he will then sort of be less prominent after leaving the White House, that he will come forward and establish the historicity of what happened, which was that he was in the program.
I have a question from Bob in the chat room, and I'll read the whole question. How well did Andy know Barack Sotaro Obama back in the DARPA days? Was he a nice guy? Does he seem different today? Like, is he cloned or mind-controlled?
Well, I didn't know him back in the days of time traveling Project Pegasus. For one reason, I misspoke when I stated on conspiracy theory with Jesse Ventura that he was in Project Pegasus. I was then having discussions with Bernard Mendez that Pegasus may have been broader than I even realized, and that it may have even linked to a Russian program called Neptune. Okay, so I misspoke there under the pressure of being interviewed by two interviewers who were both asking compound questions, which was 4 questions at once. Mm-hmm. So I want to make it clear that Barack Obama, to my knowledge, was not in Project Pegasus as a child. And I think we can secondarily corroborate that negative outcome by saying because all of the teleportees were jumping from East Coast and Midwest and, eastern locations, New England and so forth, the eastern seaboard into New Mexico, Barack Obama was living in either Hawaii or Indonesia during that entire time period of the late 60s, early 70s, so I do not believe, there's no reason to believe that he was one of the children in DARPA's Project Pegasus. We encountered Barry Soetoro, as we knew Barack Obama, in the summer of 1980 when we were trained for the CIA's Mars jump room program. He was then attending Occidental College. I ran into him later, not only when we were jumping in 81, 82, but in Los Angeles in summer of 83 after he'd already changed his name to Barack Obama, which took place at a British Commonwealth court in Skookumchuck, British Columbia on October 14th of 1982, when he changed his name in front of the court from Barack Munir Ubaid, which wherever that came from, to Barack Hussein Obama. And my memories of Barry as a young man are that he was really a fine individual. He was intelligent. He was somewhat ruminative because he was thinking deeply about philosophical and political questions. He was considerate. He was somewhat self-righteous in the sense that when somebody would say something politically incorrect, he would snap their back to them and kind of shun them publicly. He was being groomed for the presidency to the extent of being provided white papers about different issues of presidential significance. I remember one of the papers he showed me when we were briefly rooming together in summer of 80 at the dorms at College of the Siskiyous was a paper entitled The Presidency in the U.S. Constitutional System. And when he handed it to me, I saw that it had been authored by Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard Law School, which is the law school he ended up attending. And it was one of the few professors to remember him and to laud his brilliance as one of his 3 brightest law students during Professor Tribe's storied career at Harvard. Barry was pretty much a normal guy. There wasn't any of that preacher in him. There was nothing about him where he had any proneness to speechifying or being sort of that stentorian kind of preacher personality that he brought to public life. That's really the major change. What I've seen in Barack Obama as an adult and as President of the United States is a quality of moralizing in his speeches and public statements that he simply did not possess as a young man. He was much more of a relaxed guy than that.
Mm.
He's a guy who took his basketball team to the state championship in Hawaii as a senior, and I didn't see any drug use. There's all that information about Barry Soetoro, Barry Obama, as he was apparently known at Puna House School in Hawaii and at Occidental College, being heavily involved with marijuana. I didn't see any. I didn't see any illicit drug use during the summer of 80 or later. He simply was not a pothead, as he's been depicted in some of that birther literature. And there was no use of Barack Obama or any inkling of it when we knew him when he was in the jump room program. He described himself to me as Barry Soetoro, and he was a bright, relaxed guy. He was sort of like the kind of person you go to college with and you just remember fondly because he was just basically such a swell guy. I mean, he was a smart, relaxed guy. And there was nothing peculiar about his personality. He was ostensibly straight. So all these different allegations that have been made against him after he became president, I think, are basically malarkey. I mean, I think he's a heterosexual who maybe dabbled a little bit with pot like we all did. I mean, our high school graduation year was the highest pot use of any American high school cohort in the history of the United States. So, I mean, we couldn't avoid going to a high school football game without smelling pot,
Right.
He was a real regular guy. And when I think back on my college peers, I would certainly put him in the small group of people I would trust with the presidency. I mean, he was a bright, thoughtful, even deep person.
So that brings us to you. If you become president, how will you identify, prioritize, and solve what ails this planet? Because this current system is obviously not working, and it looks like it's on the verge of collapse.
To the degree the President of the United States can
do it. But, I think at some point we have to look at the global system here because the United States is kind of global, right? Yeah.
Right. Well, that's a very broad question, but I'll just identify 3 initiatives that I plan to launch the country on. One relates to foreign relations, the other relates to high technology, and the third relates to economics. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make it a goal of the United States to achieve global public teleportation by the end of my first administration in office. So if I'm elected in November of 2016 and take the oath of office on January 20th of 2017, I'm going to announce in my inaugural address that among the goals, primary goals that I will seek as president, is to declassify, deploy, and implement Tesla teleportation at the global, national, regional, and public level to literally revolutionize transport across the face of the globe under American leadership, initially directed at addressing the human component of global warming, because 60% of the greenhouse gases that are the contribution that human civilization is making to global warming on Earth come from transport. Mm-hmm. And the very astute observation that Vice President Gore made that the invention of the internal combustion engine may have been one of the disasters of contemporary civilization. When American citizens have done that, when they've launched some kind of technical initiative to bring about American leadership in applied science, America has flourished. And the examples that I would cite would be President Abraham Lincoln's establishment of the land-grant colleges, which established our basic agricultural college system, which led to our vast economic productivity, where today we produce enough food for the entire human population of 7 billion plus 5%. If we could get all those foods to starving people around the world or just hungry people around the world more efficiently, like we'll be able to do with teleportation. Another example would be President Eisenhower's establishment of the federal highway system that we take for granted, but which was even intended to allow us to move troops and personnel to the West Coast to prevent another attack in the Pacific, like Pearl Harbor. And of course, President Kennedy's initiative to land a man safely on the moon by the end of the decade of the 1960s and return him safely to Earth. I would cite just that one example of JFK's call for a lunar landing as a technical feat of this country, because that initiative paid for itself just in the improvements in household paints that were made, determining what to cover our space vehicles with. We have saved more money from the erosion of just our residential dwellings with the new paints that were synthesized as a result of the space program, that they literally paid for the space program in lack of depreciation of dwellings.
Wow,
okay.
Didn't know that. Cool.
Right. So teleportation has existed within U.S. defense community files since before 1967-68, when I first teleported with my dad. And if I take office in 2017, 40 years or 50 years? I have to do my math here. 50 years will have passed since I first teleported with my father from the old Curtiss Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Woodridge, New Jersey to Santa Fe, New Mexico. Literally a half century of non-use of a critical transportation technology. That's wrong. It was foolish to weaponize and a disaster to weaponize Tesla teleportation. And so if I'm elected president, the American people can guarantee that I will resurrect one of the great technical accomplishments of our great immigrant American genius, Nikola Tesla, and we will become the country that will be praised again as the innovator in the world, not the bully, not the Nazi, not the genocidist, not the invader, not the pilot of the Apache attack helicopter coming down to strafe somebody's village, by being the progenitor of the new form of transportation, a peaceful use of technology. The second thing I would do, a major goal of my administration, will be to wage a peace offensive. Currently, we're spending 59% of our federal budget on so-called defense. That is an hysterical approach to the threats that we present. It involves a profound corruption of government by the defense industry, and I would propose cutting our defense budget in half while simultaneously reaching out to every other major world power and asking them to do the same with us. And that is literally cut defense spending in half and utilize it to address what President Kennedy called the common enemies of the human species, which are war, poverty, ignorance, and disease.
Oh.
The third thing I will do as president is financial. I believe the American people, the American middle class, have been exploited by government on the one hand and by corporate abuse of power on the other. And so I will try to capitalize the average American. And I will do that by putting an initiative before the Congress to eliminate all taxation at the federal, state, and local level and replace it with one tax that would be gathered through a 0.5% to 1% tax on all withdrawals from federally insured banks. at the 0.5% to 1% range, that would raise federal revenues of $13 trillion to $26 trillion a year. So toward the end of the second year, we would be able to establish individual prosperity accounts rather than ask people to be industrious and frugal to save for their own individual retirement accounts. What I'm saying is that between the tax cutting of conservatives and the tax raising of liberals to pay for necessary government functions, we've ignored the great possibility of trying to raise federal spending while cutting taxes on individuals and enterprises. And how do we do that? We would do it by sipping a little bit of money at a time every time money moves from bank hands into individual hands, because that's when the individual uses capital and makes it unavailable for savings and investment. And that's when it should rightfully be taxed. In my view, that's sort of the modern analog of the export duties and inside taxes that the founders anticipated when they put the tax clause in the federal Constitution. What I'm saying is that's where the action is in the contemporary economy, is when somebody spends. Now, it wouldn't be a use tax or a consumption tax. It would simply be, so say, for example, you take $100 out of your checking account to take several colleagues to lunch, I don't know, at a sushi joint. Would it really be that painful to pay the government 50 cents to $1 from that $100 withdrawal? It'd be a lot more painless than having to work from January 1st to May 1st to make your own money to be able to afford federal, state, and local taxation. So what I'm saying here, as a model for prosperity around the world, I would try to launch America on a great experiment of raising federal spending to solve problems that can only be solved communally, which was the test that Abraham Lincoln imposed on federal spending. For example, what do you do to help injured veterans and widows and orphans? Individuals and charities can't take that on their own shoulders. It requires the whole country, the whole state. Okay, so we would actually raise federal spending. So, for example, there are no homeless in America. There are no abused children. There are no hungry people, no hungry children. But we would do that by capitalizing the American people rather than pauperizing them with the tax code. And hopefully we would then be able to consult other countries that this is how you administer this prosperity tax. Part of that would involve getting rid of the Federal Reserve, and I would launch a program where I would order, by executive order, the U.S. Treasury in furtherance of the coinage clause and the full faith and credit clause of the U.S. Constitution to begin printing U.S. notes, just as President Kennedy inaugurated before he was initiated before he was assassinated.
Yes.
We would not get rid of the IRS, because in such a system where people, for example, could hoard money, we would have to have the IRS launching programs to make sure that people are regularly paying the bank withdrawal tax. So the IRS would become what they should have been originally, which is a revenue agents. In a common plebeian democratic taxation system, you still need revenue agents to prevent people from cheating. So the IRS would be transformed into an agency that's not administering a 6,000-page tax code, but is, for example, investigating cases where a neighbor reports somebody for storing $100,000 in their mattress, okay, rather than putting it in a bank account and withdrawing it when it's needed. And
what an improvement. Oh, I think it's a great idea. Right.
And we know from the studies, this in fact was an idea of mine that was shared with me by my friend from Houston, Texas. I should give her credit, Helena DeFerro. And we're going to try to bring a pamphlet out on it, because this in fact is a problem that the American people are stuck in. They are too taxed to pay off their personal and group debt. And we will never be able to eliminate the Fed until we pay off our debt to the Fed. That's just reality, because that's a private banking system. And that private banking system has legitimate rights to the claims it makes, because private capital has been spent to fund public ventures. So it's obviously a monstrosity at this point. It is the monster of Jekyll Island, right? As G. Edward Griffin described it. We want to get rid of it, but in order to get rid of it, we have to foster prosperity among the American people who are indebted to the Federal Reserve. And we can only do that if we literally capitalize them by creating a creative form of taxation that takes enough money to even expand government, but does it in a way that is de minimis in terms of the ongoing cash flow of the individual American and our different enterprises that that enrich us.
Oh, that's a fantastic model. I wish they could do that in Greece and in Portugal and in Italy too.
I heard about a system. Oh, go ahead. Do you want to say something?
Well, no. I mean, Helena has done the projections on this, and it's not pie in the sky or some kind of Edward Bellamy kind of utopian model. That if you implement it correctly, you can even start literally redistributing capital to individuals. In other words, you can start funneling some of the revenues from this, which essentially becomes the net revenue of the transfer of goods and services in the real economy to individuals through individual prosperity accounts, where people will be able to start businesses, pay off their academic debt, have children, and be able to clothe and feed them, etc.
I heard about a similar system back in my yuppie years where they would tax everything you buy rather than withdraw from the bank. Would that work? Or
No, that's a consumption tax, and that imposes constraints on the marketing of goods and services. So that's a disincentive against those in the economy who offer goods and services.
And it hits the poor people harder than the rich people.
Right.
Okay,
or alternatively, another way of looking at it, it hits the rich more than the poor, because when a rich person buys a yacht or a second or third home, they're being imposed a penalty for consuming.
That's
So
right.
in the case of the poor, it's hitting them on their necessary expenditures of shelter, food, clothing, etc. So it's discriminatory against both the poor in their basic consumption and then the rich in their affluent consumption, and it inhibits the transmission of goods and services in the economy. We're in a depression right now. A depression occurs when industries and fields of industry top off, and then you don't need certain goods and services, and so people get fired, and then they don't have paychecks, and then liquidity begins declining, and then the credit becomes restricted, and then you have more and more people falling into basically being in a condition of not having enough cash. We are in that right now. I mean, I practice law, and I'm at the point where I'm almost ready to hire a collection attorney just to pursue my bad accounts, because as any professional within earshot will, agree, in a depression like this, you have maybe 30 to 40% of your clients that aren't paying you after you've, spent 3 months keeping them out of jail, or have put, just put $1,500 worth of, of fillings in their mouth, what have you. So we need to, the issue isn't to really enact punitive measures like, let's say, penalizing indebtedness or reestablishing debtors' prisons and all these kind of draconian medieval punishments that have been suggested on the right to try to stimulate the economy and get money into the game. We could also induce that through presidential leadership of asking billionaires to get into the game, but the problem there is they're just watching their money because they don't think they're going to see a return on it. What we need to do is we need to capitalize the average American so that everybody has extra cash in their pocket and can spend it and foment a rising tide of prosperity. And that's the only model that I've studied that I believe could bring that about, and that's why I'm going to be advancing it as president.
Well, Abe has done something not dissimilar in Japan by printing Japanese money now and making it easy for people to enter the economy with vigor again.
Right. It almost, there's the argument that's always made that recapitalization will stimulate inflation. But at the same time, if it stimulates greater productivity and a wider gyre of the consumption of goods and services, the greater amount of money that could be in the M1 money supply, not through printing of extra currency, but through literally people possessing it and being able to throw it into the economy in a transaction, is going to soak up the extra liquidity that would stimulate inflation. So I'm basically a prosperity thinker in the economic arena. It doesn't prosper our country to try to dampen or constrain inflation when the average person is undercapitalized, because such an individual is not going to spend.
And in your future, could you transport a motorcycle from the mainland to Hawaii, or is it will it work that way too, with not just transporting people but goods too?
Goods. So
you can actually send a brand new motorcycle.
Yeah, you can go on to Amazon.com and order something, and then it will go into your teleportation system right into your house.
Right. Well, there's two things we're going to be experiencing. One is, first of all, magnetic metal cannot be teleported. because it produces electrostatic discharge in the vortal tunnel. Certainly goods that are manufactured regularly with non-magnetic metal, like the zippers on a pair of pants, can be teleported. So clothing can be teleported. Food, a new generation of manufactured goods, including even high-end electronics made out of different components, like ceramic components rather than metallic ones, will all be teleportable. The other thing we're going to see the advent in during our lifetimes is going to be the synthesis of housewares in our homes through quantum teleportation, where the directions of how to make your, let's say, your stoneware in your kitchen will be sent to a microwave oven-sized box, and your stone will be synthesized literally in that device.
Right, like the on Star Trek, the what do you call it?
Right, where there'll be either there'll be literally the sending of information that will result ultimately in the creation of a product at its destination.
Well, I wanted to ask you about the extraterrestrial component of this whole thing. I know you've worked with extraterrestrials and you've seen them. Were you given any insight into future interaction with extraterrestrials and their role in human affairs? Are they going to be a player in this?
No, I was never given an overview. I did learn that they were known to be coming here from antiquity, from the time, from thousands and thousands of years ago, that they were known, and this is something that hasn't appeared in the ufological literature, something I was told by Mr. Humer, the man who taught me the system of the Astarte alphabet, which was the proposed alphabet to facilitate human extraterrestrial communication. Joseph Humer gave me a briefing on the extraterrestrial situation. One of the things he revealed was that the U.S. government knew that the extraterrestrials had, quote-unquote, been coming here purposefully for several hundred years and contacting specific individuals, and that those individuals could be expected to be contacted by the same extraterrestrials throughout their lifetime. And he said, and you are one of those individuals. Because I had revealed my ET contacts to the FBI. In fact, we've identified the name of one of the younger FBI agent who interviewed me, which was Richard Bauer Sr. He's the late father of a Facebook friend of mine named Richard Bauer Jr. Mm-hmm. So in that 1967 interview, when I was in the spring semester of my kindergarten year at Mount View Road School in Morris Plains, New Jersey, I self-identified myself as a contactee at the time when my father had just spent the last decade working on sophisticated aerospace projects to protect us from the ET presence and develop jets and so forth with which to chase their craft out of our atmosphere and away from our planet. What I did learn is what I just described, which never has appeared in really concretely in the UFO literature, which is that the government knew by 1970 that the contact experience was germane to specific individuals and could be expected to persist throughout their life. I think what the ETs decided to do, rather than destroy us, eat us, or colonize us, or any of the other things they could have done with their superior technology, is seed a more advanced civilization through specific individuals. Mm-hmm. That would explain the emergence of somebody like Nikola Tesla with this 21st century insight by somebody born in, 1869?
Right.
59?
Leonardo da Vinci was another one like that.
Yeah. So I think we have to destigmatize the contact experience and say, hey, these benevolent civilizations from outside our realm of experience, despite the fact that we were bringing rockets of mass destruction and atomic bombs of mass destruction into space, into their domain, and had even stepped on the interstitial domain that they regularly operate in, which is the fifth dimension, which is time travel, and where we find the quantum plenum between dimensions, that despite all those negatives and our propensity to engage in as our number one spectator sport, as and participant sport, as the great Stanford Terry Friedman has identified, being vast fratricidal warfare. Despite our instinct for killing our fellow human beings on the face of our planet, they still decided to carry out a multi-century program of upgrading the creativity and the planetarian thinking of specific individuals so that could lift the whole civilization into a sustainable time-space faring, platform.
Oh, that's so encouraging.
Wow. Well, we're almost out of time, Andy. How do people find you?
Well, I'm at my websites are at projectpegasus.net and projectmars.net. Your listeners are going to have to forgive me for being a couple of years behind, but I've just been too busy to really
We know
update
you are
those sites.
so busy.
Especially on Facebook, where we're now at almost 12,000 members, 11,000 members on Project Pegasus on Facebook, and our Mars Anomaly Research Society site will soon number 6,000. So those are the busy locations. Those are sort of my exchange posts for discourse about time travel and my experiences time traveling, and then the evidence that Mars is inhabited and that we've been there.
Well, thank you so much for coming on our show, Andy. It's been an incredible time with you again. Much love.
I'm going to make sure millions hear this show.
We're going to put this out there. Everybody pass it around. This is a great show.